Let's talk about Goethe and his understanding of world literature today, how he coined the term and how he also tried to write world literature in two of his books, namely The Sorrows of Young Werther and the West Eastern Divan. We'll go into some different points on these works, for example, how a whole whopping 7% of The Sorrows of Young Werther is actually a different book, a Scottish ancient poem that he wove into it. We'll also look at the fact that it's quite ironic that Goethe is still called the national poet of Germany because he was quite opposed to the concept of national literature and many more things. So yes, if you're new around here, I just want to say hello, I'm Maria. I study comparative literature in Vienna, so world literature is something I think about a lot, whether that is a possibility, how to grasp literature on a global level. That's my thing, and I make videos about that on my channel here. I'm also a big fan of Goethe, and I find that he's often misunderstood. So yeah, it's also exam season at the moment, so if I look a little tired, that's why. But there is no better way of learning, right, than explaining something to someone else. So what you're hearing today is actually part of a lecture that I have to study for my exam in a week. So, yay! Anyways, if you enjoy this kind of content, I hope you'll consider subscribing. I also have a link in my description box to my Ko-fi account. You can support the channel financially there. That really means a lot to me. I'm trying to keep all ads and other weird stuff away from this channel. So if you do that, you're directly supporting me, and I appreciate it a lot. So even the term world literature, or Weltliteratur in German, goes actually back to Goethe. He first mentioned that word in a letter in 1827 as a direct contrast to national literature. He said that the time for world literature has come and national literature is over. And he said that at a time, 1827, where that was quite an unpopular opinion to have. People were really holding on to national literature. They thought that it would form a kind of identity or a unity where no political unity was the case. And what Goethe meant by world literature was the influence that authors and works of art have on one another. And of course that was also a time back then where, streets were built, the mailing system was quicker, it was just easier to acquire literature, to read magazines, to read globally. And so Goethe came up with this communicative model of literature. And also, of course, translating and publishing was something that was practiced on a much bigger scale. And Goethe, who traveled a lot himself, just found the concept of national literature too constraining. And he made this prophecy almost that the Germans should encourage the coming together of different nationalities when it comes to literature. So Goethe thought that traveling forms us and teaches us in a way, and he traveled a lot himself and said that world literature comes into existence through traveling, not so much through correspondence, right? So you write world literature and you learn not by sitting at home and reading other people's works, but by inviting people from different countries to your home, which is something that Goethe regularly did, or to go there. He himself was quite interested in the Orient. It's a little bit of a problematic word because often the Orient is just a lumping together of North Africa, Asia, anything that is not the West or Europe or America. So, problematic term. But anyways, his interest in Islam and the Quran and the Orient led to him publishing the West Eastern Divan in 1819. And this book is a direct result of his communicative model of world literature. This is a collection of poetry that is really not some kind of trivial storytelling of the Orient, but an honest attempt at understanding and critically communicating with literature from another place. I'm gonna put a photo up on the screen here of the Goethe-Havi monument in Weimar, Germany. It's very beautiful, I find. You can see that there are 2 chairs on this picture, and they're built as an entity. So if you would turn one of those chairs upside down and you would put them together, they would form, an entity, a block. And the oriental carpet underneath them has the verses of the poet Hafi on it, and in the fringes of the carpet are Goethe's verses. And I think we're getting a pretty beautiful understanding of Goethe's approach to world literature here. He also said, this is a translation, but he said, "Many a light the Orient throws over the midland water broad. He alone who Hafi knows what Calderon has thought." Right, so you have to understand Hafi, which is a Persian poet, I think from the 12th century, to know what Calderon has written, which is a Spanish writer. So I think you can see a sort of detaching and floating above the borders of nationality. And I think what Goethe tried to communicate or discovered was that if you're interested in finding truth, you have to consider all the sources, and maybe, that's my interpretation, but maybe in the overlap you'll find some kernel of truth about the human experience. I'll read you just a little part from the West Eastern Divan in German. He said, "Gottes ist der Orient, Gottes ist der Okzident. Nord- und südliches Gelände ruht im Frieden seiner Hände." Right, that God has the Orient and the Occident in either one of his hands, and they lie peacefully there. And this collection of poetry was actually not very successful. It wasn't received very well. People said it's too difficult to understand. Also, a lot of people complained that Goethe was not political enough, that he only enjoys and withdraws in literature, and that he's not exercising his influence, that he's too unpolitical, even though he could do so much more. A different attempt at world literature was his writing of The Sorrows of Young Werther. This book came out when he was only 24 years old, and it caused a huge amount of controversy. I'll get to that in a moment. But if you've ever read The Sorrows of Young Werther, you might have noticed that a whopping 7% of it is actually from Ossian, the son of Fingal, which is an 18th century ancient epic poem from Scotland. So he has woven that poem into his writing. And just a quick detour about Ossian. It is, as I said, an ancient epic poem. The first volume are invocations and songs, and volume 2 and 3 are epic poems. And the author apparently found those ancient poems and translated them. But he also added quite some things, so it's a little controversial as to how genuine his claim of it being ancient is. But yeah, the author, James Macpherson, says that it's genuine Scottish poetry. And the overall consensus is that it's not fake, but it's a translation with a lot of additions. And when this book came out in the 18th century, there were quite some big changes happening in Scotland. Scotland became united with England to prevent bankruptcy, and there were quite some battles and national dramas happening at the time. So people didn't really see a future for Scotland. And Ossian was a kind of intellectual comfort for them, because in this text that is apparently genuine old Scottish poetry, they found that the cultural history of their country is held in essence and that, you know, it can form a cultural identity where it was getting lost during that time. And so Ossian was wildly successful in Scotland at the time. But what the book is actually about is it praises the downfall of heroes. It's all about death and the way that Ossian is the only one left, and all he can do is sing about that death and that downfall of everything. They call it like the joy of grief. It also beautifully describes the natural world of Scotland. It creates a picture of a very rough, cold north as opposed to the south. And Lord of the Rings, by the way, was also very influenced by Ossian in their characters, but also in the visually, like in the landscapes. So Ossian is often called a little bit the Homer of the North, and it's like a rough flip on Homer, because in Homer's stories the world is always in the end a good place, right? At the end of his stories, the gods are in their place and there is harmony. But with Ossian, all the gods are dead and he's the last one, and all he can do is just sing about it. So it is a kind of turning away from a holistic worldview, which was also popular back then because it was just the start of the downfall of institutionalized religion, right? So that resonated a lot with quite some people. So all those things were good for the circulation of Ossian. But what has encouraged the circulation even more was it being such a big part in the Sorrows of Young Werther. As I said, 7% of the Werther are actually direct quotes from Ossian. In addition to that, Ossian is discussed a lot by the characters in the Sorrows of Young Werther. Werther and Lotte read Ossian, and you always know that from then on it goes downhill again. And that joy of the downfall is definitely also a theme that comes back in the Sorrows of Young Werther. Werther even says to Willem in one of his letters that Ossian hat in meinem Herzen den Homer verdrängt, right? So Ossian replaced Homer for me in my heart. Russia actually came in touch with Ossian only through the Sorrows of Young Werther. And I just find it fascinating to think about the conditions that have to be going on in the world in order for a work to be received so well. As I said, Goethe was only 24 when he published it, and it was so controversial. I'd love to make a dedicated video about Werther in the future, because I've actually just read a very long scientific article on the question of whether this book actually caused a suicide wave or not. Yeah, it's overall just such a gorgeous, beautiful work of German literature. Like, every time I open it, I just think about how lucky I am that I speak German. Also really cool, I'll just mention that as a last point, is how nature becomes a metaphor for inner life, both in the Sorrows of Young Werther and in Ossian. And it's interesting to think that back then there was no psychology, right? People didn't have a concept of the unconscious, really before Freud. So they describe their inner workings and their inner life through nature, through the outside, and call them landscapes of the soul, right? Seelenlandschaften in German. I find that so beautiful. I see that a lot in the writings of Henry David Thoreau as well. I find it intriguing to pay attention to how the descriptions of sentiments and inner feelings have evolved over the centuries of literature. Okay, so that's it with my little input on world literature and Goethe for today. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you again very soon. Bye-bye.